So ladies and gentlemen, with the miracle of modern technology, welcome by Zoom, the author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, Mark Dawidziak. Welcome, Mark.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Hello, Arlen.
Well, hello there. Let's see, I want to begin first by thanking you for acknowledging my book right up front in your acknowledgments, which when I read your book for the first time, totally blew me away. So I want to thank you for that.
Well deserved.
But why don't I let you first describe what Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone was about, why you wrote it, and then I'll give you a little interesting interpretation I have of it when you're done introducing it for our great audience here.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote it was because Mark Twain wrote the wonderful book you referred to,
Right.
The Twilight Zone Companion. I wanted to be the guy who wrote that book. In the early 1980s, I had just written my first book, which was a slice of theater history. And people kept saying, well, what's your next book going to be? And that's always a flattering question because it supposes there will be another book, and that's never a given. But I kept saying, well, I know what my next book's going to be. I'm going to write the history of the Twilight Zone because it's my favorite series of all time. The theater book I had written, I had actually interviewed Claude Akins and Fritz Weaver, who had both been at this theater, and they both had been in 2 Twilight Zone episodes each. And I kind of fooled myself into thinking I was actually going to write this book. And then I walked into a bookstore in 1982, and there it was, The Twilight Zone Companion. And I took that book home, and I read it, and I couldn't even get mad because Mark did such a great
You
job.
weren't alone,
He set the standard. I mean, Mark set the standard for books about TV shows, how it should be done. So I immediately went to my second favorite TV show, which was Columbo, and tried to set out to write as good a book on Columbo as Mark had done on the Twilight Zone. That was my goal. And that book was published in 1989 as the Columbo Phile. But all through the years, I kind of always, in the back of my mind, thought I was owed a Twilight Zone book. And when my daughter turned 15, she had seen a fierce amount of classic television. She loved classics. She watched the Dick Van Dyke Show, the Andy Griffith Show.
You did your parental duty.
Yeah. So when she turned 15, I said, your undergraduate work in classic television is done. It's time to start your postgraduate work. It's time for you to enter the Twilight Zone. And we started a forced march through all 156 episodes. And we very quickly got to the first season episode, Escape Clause, with David Wayne as the hypochondriac, who makes a deal with the devil. And he signs a contract. And there's an escape clause in the contract. And if you know anything about the Twilight Zone at all, you know this is not going to end well for David Wayne.
Of course.
And when things played out at the end of the episode, I jokingly turned to my daughter and said, now you just let that be a lesson to you. And I said, always read contracts carefully. Always look for loopholes. Always think that Rod Serling's standing right behind you when you're about to sign a contract. And we laughed about it, and this became a standard running joke. We watch an episode, and I'd say, let that be a lesson to you, because I can run a joke into the ground with the best of them. And after a few of these, the penny finally dropped, and I went, wait. This is your book, stupid. This is your Twilight Zone book. Each one of these episodes is a life lesson. It's a morality tale. It's a parable. All you need to do is extract the life lessons. And so the title is not facetious. The title, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, actually is it. Is it a roadmap for how you can live your life? I think it is. And,
Isn't your subtitle, it's not actually on the book cover, but it's a 5th dimension guide to life.
Right, exactly. And I really do think that's the case. But it was sharing this book with my daughter that really gave me this gift of the Twilight Zone, and I set out to. It's like the book is written in a very conversational way, as you know. It is not a deep academic philosophical treatise. I'm not that kind of a writer. I'm a popular writer, and you can't be a different writer than you are. So it's a very conversational book. It's a Twilight Zone fan's conversation with other Twilight Zone fans.
Well, Mark, just to let people know, Mark organized his book into 50 chapters, of each chapter having a Twilight Zone, or sometimes more than one episode, along with the lesson that is learned from the episode, and then Mark's very entertaining, illuminating prose describing that life lesson out of that episode or episodes.
No, and it's probably my most personal book because it has the most of me in it.
Yeah.
Because I do draw, I use my own voice in a very essay-like way. So it's my wife's favorite book, I think, for that reason. Because I do draw a lot on my own experiences and how these Twilight Zone episodes impacted me growing up. And, because, I was attracted to the Twilight Zone the way most people are. I was very young. I was not old enough to see it in its first run. I was
right, neither was I.
Just missed it. But a station in New York, dear old WPIX channel.
Yes.
Started rerunning the Twilight Zone almost immediately in the mid-'60s. That's when I discovered it. I was about 9 or 10 when I first started watching them. And I was watching it for the creepy factor, that wonderful moment at the end where the hair in the back of your neck would go up. That's what I was watching it for. And then
no, but I think you speak for a generation of people
right.
That I didn't see it in its original run either, but God bless reruns. By the way, we should be telling people, Mark, where are you coming in from in Ohio?
I am in the metropolis of Cuyahoga Falls, which if anybody knows Ohio geography, this is close to Akron, about 40 miles south of Cleveland.
But you grew up in New York?
Yeah, I grew up in Huntington, New York, on the which is almost exactly across the Sound from Westport.
What the?
You can basically go to a peach in Huntington and wave, and you're basically pointing at Westport.
I had relatives in Huntington.
Sure, and so that's where I grew up, and then I followed the newspaper trail, which deposited me in Northeast Ohio, where I worked as a TV critic for many years with the Akron paper first, and then Cleveland. So, yeah.
Listen, if I had read your resume, we wouldn't have time for anything else, You've got a very incredible resume. I just want to say, when you read Mark's book, for me personally, I loved his writing was so beautiful about so many episodes that are not in my book. Now, what's interesting, I think I told you, I only chose 68 episodes, Mark, out of 156 that I think are worthy writing about. Now, remember I told you some people like a certain episode and other people don't? But I think art historians, right, Mark, and critics, what they do with a lot of their time is make consensuses of what they think is the best in a certain genre. Not everything is great equally, even if you think it's great, or maybe it is great, but this is what people have been debating about. What I love about Mark's book personally is that he writes so beautifully, extracting the lessons from some of these episodes that, again, I didn't write about, but Mark did. So I think between the two of our books, Mark, we cover all 156 episodes. But one of the main things I enjoyed about your book was the comparison you make between Mark Twain, who you are, of course, an expert in, and Rod Serling. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about this Twain-Serling connection and the phrase moralist in disguise.
Yeah, I do an entire talk about this because there is a chapter in the book which looks at this, and it goes back to a phrase which a French girl had sent Mark Twain a fan letter in the early 1900s, when the world kind of knew Mark Twain as a humorist, a family author, a funny man. And the little girl had sent this letter to Twain, very perceptive letter. Her name was Helene Picard. And in it she wrote, I know the world knows you as a funny man, but I think that behind all of the laughter, you're trying to teach us something. And Twain writes this amazing girl back a letter, and where he basically says to her, you've got it. You're on it, but don't tell anybody, because I am a moralist in disguise. And what he's basically saying was that he was using humor to teach a lesson. Now, is there a better definition of Rod Serling and what he ultimately does with the Twilight Zone than being a moralist in disguise?
Well, Mr. Dawidziak, point counterpoint. I think Serling was not in disguise. He wore his morals on his sleeve. He was criticized for it. They called it Serling sermons, just like they criticized Frank Capra for Capricorn. And whereas Mark Twain might have been a moralist in disguise. I think Serling was a moralist out there.
Well, so was Twain, actually. I mean, in point of fact, you know, Twain is playing, you know, a game here when he calls himself
Right.
a moralist in disguise. But the person that Rod was in disguise, the people Rod was in disguise to, wasn't the people. It was to the network censors.
Right.
It was to the standards and the practices.
Yes,
people
the censors.
who didn't understand what he was doing. What he was basically saying the exact same things. His themes
Right.
never changed. That's the amazing thing about Rod.
Right.
His themes don't change. And he was writing about the exact same things in the Twilight Zone that he'd been writing about.
But Mark, you know, last night we screened the episode The Shelter. And if you know what happens at the end of the episode about the bomb shelter, and it's a false alarm, but all the neighbors broke in and now everything's been shattered. Their beautiful, peaceful life. So the protagonist, the owner of the shelter, delivers an incredible Rod Serling moral speech at the end, really, and beautifully written. Again, you know, Capricorn, Serling sermons, but when it's done well, it's done well. And when the scene ends, Serling's voiceover comes on and he goes, no moral, no prophetic track, just a statement of fact. And I'm thinking to myself, Rod, you just gave an incredible moral prophetic lesson. So that's what I mean about, yeah, maybe to the censors who are dumb as a pile of bricks, couldn't recognize those morals, but I think the rest of us got it loud and clear.
You know, and the other thing that I think is a bigger point of comparison between Twain and Serling is that very, very few writers are of their time and yet timeless.
Yes.
In other words, you know, that you read them and they seem like they're talking about us today. How
yes,
many times
absolutely.
do you read Mark Twain and he says something about politicians, or he says something about religion, or he says something, and it's like he's talking to us today, and he talks in a language which is very alive. It doesn't seem dated. It doesn't sound like Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Serling is exactly that way.
Yeah.
Serling stuff, even though maybe he's writing about the McCarthy era and Monsters Are Due in Maple Street, it now seems like a more resonant episode today than when he wrote it. And the language, even though the fashion seemed dated and it's in black and white, and you know there are no iPhones or anything like that, even with all of that, it seems like he's talking to us about today.
Yep.
And that is an incredibly tricky thing for a writer to pull off.
I was talking to audience members. I'm sorry. I was talking to audience members who saw yesterday, and they said those episodes, The Shelter and Monsters on Maple Street, which, by the way, we're going to talk about more. I just wanted to add, Mark, one little Mark Twain connection to the Twilight Zone is that the great director of photography who won an Emmy for his work on the Twilight Zone, George T. Clemens, was a direct descendant of Samuel T. Did you know that?
He was a distant. He wasn't direct because Twain
indirect?
had no direct. Twain only had 4 children. 1 died young, 2 died unmarried before, so he only has 1 daughter who survives him. She only has a daughter, and that daughter dies in the 60s. So the direct line ends in 1966. But there are Clemenses, and then on the other side of the fence, the Langdons, there are a lot of cousins and such who are still around.
Mark, I'm checking with the judges, and they will accept my answer. I should have known not to mix it up with an expert, and what do I know? But by the way, speaking of Monsters Are Due on Maple Street and The Shelter, you said in your chapter, wait, let me get my notes in front of me.
Always bad when you
Hold on.
You know, that's trouble.
You said The Shelter is not as powerfully written as The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And let me just say in my defense, I will quote another great writer, Stephen King, in his Dance Macabre book. When he talked about The Shelter, he said, rarely has any television program dared to present human nature in such an ugly, revealing light. But you think it was not as well written as Monsters?
I think The Monsters Due in Maple Street. You know, if you were to say, you know, and Twilight Zone's a Rorschach test. You know, you say, like, what are your favorite Twilight Zones? Which ones do you like? Which ones do you think work?
Right.
It always ends up saying more about you than it does the
Of course.
You know, so The Monsters Are Due in Maple Street. When somebody says to me, what's your favorite Twilight Zone episode? I always say, that depends on the day you ask me. But The Monsters Are Due in Maple Street is always going to be in my top 5. I think it's one of Rod's really sublime pieces of writing.
Well, I think when I'm sorry, go on.
No, I just got to say, but that's the great thing about the Twilight Zone is it's open to endless interpretation. It's open to endless, as a critic, you understand one of the first things you understand is that your role is not to kill conversation. It's to start it. It's to inspire it. So when somebody comes up to me and says, I read your book and I took a different lesson away from that, the first thing I said is good for you.
Right.
That you've been issued a working brain by the universe, and that's what you're supposed to do. It's not my job to make up your mind.
Right.
It's not my job. That's your job.
Exactly.
And you're doing this right. That's your. So I never mind when I extracted 50 life lessons. There are hundreds of them.
Of course.
One of the unsaid part of the conversation is when somebody comes up to me and says, "This is my favorite lesson I learned from the Twilight Zone." I can't wait to hear it.
Right.
I cannot wait to hear what they have to say.
Right. Okay, moving on. In the chapter that you devote to the great George Clayton Johnson episode, Nothing in the Dark, with, yes, young Robert Redford as the Angel of Death. And there's young George Clayton Johnson, who also wrote the first episode of Star Trek, by the way. Great science fiction writer. But in that chapter, Mark organizes his book where at the end of every chapter he has a testimonial by a famous actor, director, producer, artist, right? All different types. Right. And he got a quote from Robert Redford himself that went, "The Twilight Zone touched a particular nerve about the surreal and the human in a new and extraordinary way." Now, Mark, before I respond to that quote, I want to hear how you take that quote and what's your take on it.
Well, I would agree with it, and I think it does. I think that's one of the things that really made the Twilight Zone seem so fresh and original when it came out, when Newton Minow gives the famous, vast wasteland speech, and he basically says, when television is better, it is good, it's better than anything else. And his prime example of that was the Twilight Zone. And I think that's, one of the things Redford is responding to. I think it's something we kind of all, even if we didn't fully understand what was going on in the Twilight Zone the first time we watched it, we did sense that there was something going on.
Yeah. Well, the key word in that quote that I wanted to key in on was his use of the word surreal. Because in my book, I posit that the Twilight Zone, people think it's a science fiction show. Well, of course, it had a lot of science fiction episodes. People think it was a fantasy show or a horror show. But I maintain in my book that the Twilight Zone was surrealism on television. And the way I came up with that is that in the very first ad in the newspapers by CBS for the first episode, October 2nd, 1959, if you read the description, defined by the author as the land that lies between science superstition, between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge, you will find the bizarre but the believable, the different, the shocking, that is yet understandable. Now, when I did my research into surrealism, it was created by a French poet, André Breton, in 1924. This is the 100th anniversary of surrealism, which started out as a literary movement. In the aftermath of World War I, poets wanted people to write kind of in a state of almost trance-like, dreamlike state and write what they called automatic writing. But Breton, like a lot of the post-World War I artists, wrote manifestos. And in his 1929 Surrealist Manifesto, he described it as, there exists a spot in the mind between life and death, between real and the imaginary, between the past and the future, between the high and the low, that will one day cease to appear contradictory. Well, to me, if they could look in a crystal ball, they would have seen Serling as a surrealist who put surrealism on television. Another one of his statements was that surrealism was as beautiful as the unexpected meeting on a dissection table between an umbrella and a sewing machine. And what he was trying to talk about was surrealism is about this juxtaposition of the real and the imaginary, two things that don't belong together, but when you bring them together, you create a third reality. The Twilight Zone had incredible surrealist episodes that had juxtapositions between an old farmhouse and a futuristic spaceship, or finding a lion in your bedroom. And that's what I loved, Mark, about Robert Redford's quote, is that he mentioned the word surreal.
You know, I agree, because I think that this was one of the great strengths of the Twilight Zone, is that the other anthology shows at the time pinned themselves down to one genre, one specific genre. Yeah,
like Outer Limits,
was a mystery. Outer Limits was science fiction. Thriller was horror. And the Twilight Zone embraced all of it. The Twilight Zone is a very, very big tent. And it was one of the smartest things they did. It's very hard to define. Surrealism comes into it because it is very, very hard to define, because that's sort of one of the things that wraps around it. And I think when you try to define the Twilight Zone, you just go right back home to what Rod said it was. It's as vast as space and as timeless as infinity.
Yep.
It turns out he was right. It is.
Okay, moving on in your book, lesson 25, called That Which Does Not Kill You Makes You Stronger. You ended with a Ray Bradbury quote, famous, right? Greatest American science fiction writer, right? Ray Bradbury. And you said that Bradbury never had a bad word to say about Serling or the Twilight Zone. Now, what I'm going to ask you about is, what about all the infamous claims of Ray Bradbury about Serling plagiarizing Bradbury, especially the episode Walking Distance, which Bradbury claimed was taken from the carousel scene in the short story Something Wicked This Way Comes. And Serling, of course, denied it, but the word got around. And this is what Ray Bradbury, Mark, said about Serling back then. Maybe he changed his tune in his older age. He said, Rod is a Johnny-come-lately who will come and go and be forgotten in the science fiction field. His greatest strength, and I wish he would realize it, lies in the sort of powerful realism he did for Playhouse 90. I wish he would go back to that and leave the science fiction to us guys who know how to do it, meaning myself, Chuck Beaumont, Robert Heinlein, and others. Mr. Dawidziak, what do you have to say to that?
You know, I think Ray was jealous. You know, I did know Ray for quite a while. And in the 80s, he did change his tune, and then he went back largely because Bill Nolan kind of convinced him to go back and said, oh, no, Rod stole everything. And that became his line. Plagiarism is the one of the harshest things you can say about a writer, but it's also one of the easiest things to prove. It's a one-on-one. So I've always said, and I said at the time, because Harlan Ellison brought this, who was a good friend of mine, and Harlan also knew Bill Nolan, and Harlan kind of went on that trail too, about, oh, Rod stole everything that he wrote. And I said, you know, Harlan, all right, it's easy. Give me the one-to-one proof. Show it to me. What's the story he stole? And Richard Matheson, who was an even closer friend over the years, Richard dismissed this completely. Richard said, what Ray does not realize when he says that thing, how hurtful it is, because he's not just attacking Rod, he's attacking Chuck Beaumont and me.
Of course.
And he said, you know, a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes that people point to and say, aha, that's stealing from Ray Bradbury, those were our episodes.
Exactly.
They're not Rod's episodes. They're our episodes.
Well, but Mark, let me ask something specifically. Do you think Walking Distance is ripping off Something Wicked This Way Comes?
No. The only there's a carousel, but the carousel does not. There's not any evil circus. There's not evil carnival. The only thing those two stories have in common is that there is a carousel in them.
Yeah.
And there were
Strangers on a Train has a carousel.
Before. Yeah. But there were carousels in stories before Ray's.
Of course.
You know, so I mean, there's just to say, oh, there's a carousel, so that must be.
But then, Mark, you're hitting on what I think is the real truth, which is hard to prove. In my reading of history, I think Bradbury and the other science fiction writers, they were all a clique in California at the time. And they all thought Serling, and I'm generalizing here, Mark, but they all thought Serling was a dilettante who cherry-picked their beautiful little short stories that at the time only a cult of science fiction fans read. Science fiction was not widely read like it is today. And I believe, Mark, that Bradbury, who had successes in every genre except television, and I thought he was jealous of Serling, and I thought the other science fiction writers who badmouthed Serling were jealous of his success on the Twilight Zone, whereas I thought Serling did them a disservice by bringing them out of this ghetto of cultish, you know, what do you call that? Ivory tower, you know, where science fiction writers thought they were. And Serling brought their cloistered, that's the word I was looking for, their cloistered works to everybody and made science fiction safe for America and our modern American popular culture.
Remember something else. In the truth, you know, Ray Bradbury's publisher, Bantam Books, always put up the greatest living science fiction writer on all of his books.
Yeah.
Every paperback always had that on it. In truth, Ray wasn't a science fiction writer either. He was a fantasy writer. You know, Ray, not like Asimov, not like Heinlein, not like Clarke. They were the hardcore science fiction writers. Most of what you look at Ray, The Martian Chronicles isn't science fiction in the true sense of what science fiction is. It's fantasy. So is the October Country.
But Mark, to the lay public, they don't distinguish between science fiction and fantasy like experts do. And I think that's...
And they are closely allied, and it's hard to say where the lines are.
Right.
But, you know, the thing is, where I always go back to on this one is, if there was a member of the so-called group who were around Ray Bradbury at the time, you know, one of the principals was Richard Matheson. And Matheson would have none of this. And nobody had a better vision and a better view of all of this. The Twilight Zone,
of course.
what Rod was doing, what Ray was doing, what Chuck Beaumont was his best friend. Chuck Beaumont was Richard Matheson's best friend.
Well, I think we've
and he'd have none of it.
I'm sorry, I think we've definitively proved that Ray Bradbury did not know what he was talking about when he accused Serling of plagiarism. Case closed. Let's move on. Speaking of Richard Matheson, A World of His Own, which was the very last episode of the first season and the very first time we see Rod Serling on camera, by the way, at the end of the episode. But it's all about a writer played by Keenan Wynn, who, kind of like Serling, it's Matheson writing a Serling doppelganger, can talk into his tape recorder and make his characters come to life like the ghostly image of his mistress that he created for the wife there on the right side. But the reason why I bring this episode up, Mark, is that you concluded with a beautifully written paragraph that I'd love to read to the audience now. As you pull back from that final scene, it grows in perspective. Gregory, that name of the character by Eden Wynn, Gregory West, represents the writers on the Twilight Zone, using their imaginations to shape a better world. But he also represents all fantasy writers. Pull back a little more and you see that Gregory represents all writers who realize that storytelling is, in itself, an act of hope and optimism. Pull back a little more and you see that Gregory represents us, using our imaginations as starting points to reach for something perhaps wondrous and wonderful. Many of us feel that door to something better is locked, but the Twilight Zone is always there to remind us that you unlock this door with the key of imagination. Mark, that was one of the most beautiful paragraphs I've ever read.
And you know what? I don't remember writing. I'm just sitting here going, hey, that's pretty good. How about that? You know?
If I could call security and have you removed, I would. Okay, moving on. Another great comparison you make, not just to Mark Twain, but you also compare Rod Serling as our American Dickens, because when you think about A Christmas Carol, it's really the first Twilight Zone episode, right? A man being visited by three ghosts from the past, the present, and the future. And I mean, isn't that the first Twilight Zone episode?
Yeah, certainly is. And it quotes the first, Earl Holliman quotes Christmas Carol.
Exactly.
In the very first one.
Right,
So,
the one with Art Carney as Santa.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, this segues into another great American 20th century, well, Dickens was English, but Ambrose Bierce, who we're going to talk about, and you can see in the description the extraordinary life of the man who many consider to be the predecessor of today's black humorists, a life stranger than his own fiction, followed by an even stranger death, which is why this portrait of him comes complete with a skull. But Mark, I know you're an expert in Ambrose Bierce. I just wanted to take the audience through a cornucopia of titles that shows you, if you know nothing about Ambrose Bierce, I mean, read the titles: Tales of Psychological and Supernatural Horror, Ghost Stories of Ambrose Bierce, The Devil's Dictionary, what the Ambrose Bierce Satanic Reader? Of course, he wrote a little blue book of Civil War horrors, which in this book called Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, I think it was published 1901 in San Francisco, comes the short story that we're going to talk about, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. So, Mark, can you give us a quick capsule take on who and why was Ambrose Bierce?
Bierce was actually an Ohio boy. He was born in Meigs County. I think one of the most interesting things about Bierce, he was the 10th of 13 children, all of whom were given names starting with the letter A. Now, you talk about a family that was stuck on something. I mean, they named all their Abigail, Amelia, Anne.
But that's the
Addison,
least weird thing about him.
Augustus, and by the time they got to 10, they got to Ambrose. And, but he, of everything that Bierce wrote, because Bierce, he does join the 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, and he sees a lot of action, and he sees actions in brutal places. He sees action at Shiloh, at Chickamauga, at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. He's wounded.
Which is just like Serling in World War II.
When he pours, and this is something he and Serling have in common, they both saw the horrors of war up close as young men. And marked them in very, very different ways because, they called Bierce, his nickname was Bitter Bierce, because he was, the Devil's Dictionary is a very cynical run of definitions about human nature. And, he makes Mark Twain look like the merry optimist, Ambrose Bierce. But I think the real core of his literary achievement there's that little group of stories, perfect stories, just perfect, about the Civil War, about his experiences in the Civil War. These used to be curriculum. Everybody used to read these in high school. Not just An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, but One of the Missing, The Mockingbird, Chickamauga. These stories were basic curriculum, and they aren't anymore. Which
Why?
I think is a shame. I don't know. I don't know why Bierce has run out, but a lot of people have jumped out of curriculum.
But you would think Occurrence would have kept his name alive.
Well, so is One of the Missing. One of the Missing is another perfect Twilight Zone. They could have done One of the Missing, because One of the Missing is about a soldier who is out on patrol, and he's a sniper. He's got a rifle, and a Confederate cannon goes off, and it blows up the structure around him. And when he wakes up, he is trapped under debris, and his own rifle, which was cocked when he was knocked out, is pointing directly at him, and he can't move. And any movement could discharge the rifle.
Wow.
And it is the whole episode is about this guy trapped in this circumstances, and how it ends. I don't want to end it for anybody who hasn't read this story, but it's got a real. Bierce loved those snap endings. He loved those.
The ending to Owl Creek Bridge puts the snap in snap endings, if you know what I mean. The first visualization. I'm assuming you've seen the Alfred Hitchcock version from 1959, folks. Right. If you watch the 1959 half-hour Alfred Hitchcock version of Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and then you watch the short French film made in 1962, it was a winner at the Cannes Film Festival, and it won an Oscar, the following year for Best Short Film. Serling and Company bought the rights to air it as a television episode in 1964. This version makes the Alfred Hitchcock version look like the worst summer stock ever performed. Not here in Westport, of course. But I mean, one is literally an art film, and the other is as pedestrian as the one we're gonna watch now is artistically made. I only wish we had the time to kind of punish you first by making you watch the Alfred Hitchcock version, and you would actually appreciate the French version more. The original title, La Rivière du Hibou, means the river of the owl, not exactly a direct translation. Robert Enrico, shown here in the early 60s, young French director. He later went on to do some really incredible films and has a whole other career. But here's the first poster for the film in '62. And like I said, Serling and Company loved it so much, like everybody loved it, obviously, and bought the rights to air it in the spring of 1964, the last year of the show. Now, in my book, it's the last essay in my book. And you can see here on the double-page spread of my essay, this is the original TV Guide ad. Remember they used to have close-ups? TV Guide once was the Bible. You couldn't watch TV, remember, without TV Guide? And those fall preview issues? But I love how it actually says, viewers with long memories may recall an earlier version of occurrence in December '59. So Mark, we're gonna watch Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge together with our beautiful audience here. And then when it's over, we're gonna have a little chat about it, leading, of course, to Jacob's Ladder. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to present one of my favorite episodes, even though technically it's not a Twilight Zone episode, but it really is, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.